He sneered, his $1,000 suit shining under the chandelier. "She can't even read the menu," he boomed, pointing a manicured finger at the young waitress. He was a billionaire, used to getting his way, and he was trying to impress his French clients. He assumed the woman in the apron was uneducated, simple, invisible. He thought she was just there to pour water. He never imagined that this one waitress, with her tired eyes and cheap shoes, was about to destroy his multi-million-dollar deal and his entire world. The scent of seared scallops and clarified butter hung heavy in the air at L'Étoile d'Or, a perfume Eve Martin knew better than her own. It was the smell of money, of a world she served but could never touch. Tonight, that scent was mixed with something else, the acidic tang of her own anxiety. "Table 7 is cold on their consommé," hissed Mr. Henderson, the restaurant manager, his face a permanent mask of stressed parchment. "Yes, Mr. Henderson." Eve balanced 3 plates on her left arm, the porcelain hot against her skin. Her wrist ached. It was a deep, familiar pain that radiated up from her bones, a constant reminder that this, the apron, the sore feet, the polite, empty smile, was her life now. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be in a library, surrounded by 18th century manuscripts, finishing her doctorate at Columbia. But that was before her father's investments collapsed, before the family friend had vanished with their savings, and before the bank had foreclosed on their Upper West Side home. Now, her reality was cheap roommates in a tiny Queens apartment and a stack of student loan deferment letters she was too scared to open. L'Étoile d'Or was one of New York's most exclusive French restaurants. Getting a job here, even as a low-level server, had been a miracle. The clientele was old money and new tech, faces she recognized from Forbes and Vogue. They ate, they drank, and they tipped, often badly. Eve navigated the plush crimson carpet, her black non-slip shoes squeaking faintly. She passed Mark, the bartender, who was polishing a glass with unnecessary vigor. "Big night, Eve," he smirked. "Heard the shark is coming in." Eve kept her expression neutral. "The shark?" "Damien Thorne," Mark said, his voice dropping. "Real estate, tech. The guy basically owns half of Hudson Yards. He's a nightmare. Chews up waiters and spits them out. And," he leaned in conspiratorially, "he's bringing the French investors, the ones from the Journal article. A $50 million deal is on the line tonight, right at table 12. Eve's stomach tightened. Table 12, her section. "Why me?" she muttered, adjusting the plates. "Because," Mark said, gesturing to her with his polishing cloth, "you're the only one Henderson trusts not to spill soup on a billionaire's lap. You're invisible, Eve. Efficient. You're wallpaper." Wallpaper. The word stung, mostly because it was true. In her old life, Eve had been fluent, vibrant, seen. Here she was a ghost in a black uniform. Mr. Henderson snapped his fingers from across the dining room. "Martin, table 12, they're early." Eve dropped the cold consommé at the service station, grabbed a fresh water carafe, and smoothed the front of her apron. Her hands were trembling. "Just get through the night, Eve. Just get through this one table." She took a deep breath, pictured the balance on her student loan statement, and walked toward the best table in the house, where the fate of $50 million was about to be decided. Damien Thorne didn't walk into a room. He conquered it. He entered L'Étoile d'Or not as a guest, but as a predator assessing new territory. He was flanked by 2 others, a striking, silver-haired man and a woman in her late 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Damien was tall, his Brioni suit tailored so perfectly it looked molded to his muscular frame. A heavy Patek Philippe watch adorned his wrist, catching the light from the chandelier. But it was his eyes that held the room, cold, blue, and utterly devoid of warmth. He was already talking, his voice a low, confident boom that cut through the restaurant's hushed ambiance. "And the zoning permits are a mere formality, Antoine. I have the mayor on speed dial," Damien was saying, clapping the older man on the shoulder. The older man, who Eve presumed was Antoine, offered a polite, thin-lipped smile. "That is reassuring, Monsieur Thorne. But as we discussed, the cultural preservation of the Parisian district is paramount." His English was precise, elegant, and heavily accented. Culture, of course." Damien waved a dismissive hand. "We'll build a lovely plaza. People love plazas." Eve approached, the water carafe feeling like a block of ice in her hand. "Good evening, sir, madam. Welcome to l'Étoile d'Or. May I offer you some water, still or sparkling?" Damien didn't even look at her. He continued his conversation, gesturing emphatically. The woman, however, turned her gaze on Eve. It was an appraising look, not unkind, but analytical. "Sparkling, please," the woman said. Her voice was a low contralto, her French accent different from the man's, more modern, Parisian. "And for you, Antoine?" "Still, s'il vous plaît, Geneviève," the man, Antoine, replied. Eve nodded, her movements economical and precise. She poured the water, her hands steady, despite the man's overpowering presence. Damien was still ignoring her, now pulling out his phone. "See this? That's the projection for Q4. Astounding," he said, shoving the phone toward Antoine. "Excuse me, sir?" Eve said, her voice just loud enough to cut through. Damien Thorne finally looked at her. It wasn't a glance. It was an act of interruption, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken. He sighed, a sound of profound and exaggerated irritation. "What?" he snapped. "The menu, sir," Eve said, holding out 3 leather-bound menus. Fine, give it here." He snatched one from her hand. Mr. Henderson was watching from across the room, wringing his hands. Damien flipped open the menu. L'Étoile d'Or, in its quest for authenticity, printed its menu entirely in French. No helpful English subtitles. No concessions. Usually the captains or senior waiters were there to translate, but for a VIP table, the restaurant assumed a certain level of sophistication. Eve watched as Damien's eyes scanned the page. A flicker of something. Confusion? No, it was immediately masked by more bluster. "Right," he said, closing the menu with a thud. "We'll start with the foie gras, and bring a bottle of the 90 Margaux, the Chateau Margaux." He pronounced it Margaux, the X sounding like a chisel on concrete. Eve fought to keep her expression neutral. A 1990 Chateau Margaux, a $5,000 bottle of wine. "An excellent choice, sir," she said softly. "And for the appetizers?" "I just told you. The foie gras," he repeated, louder this time. "Of course, sir. For the entire table?" "No," Antoine, the older gentleman, interjected gently. "I'm afraid my stomach is not robust. Perhaps the coquille Saint-Jacques? And you, Geneviève?" "The potage parmentier for me," the woman said, smiling at Eve. "It is cold out." Damien looked annoyed, his carefully planned performance already off script. "Fine, whatever. Just get the wine. And hurry." He flapped his hand at Eve, a gesture of dismissal. She turned, her back rigid, and walked toward the sommelier station, the billionaire's grating pronunciation of Margaux echoing in her ears. It was just the beginning of the assault. The dinner progressed like a slow-motion car crash. Damien Thorne held court, his voice drowning out the delicate notes of the string quartet playing in the corner. He dominated the conversation, speaking of leverage, buyouts, and hostile takeovers. His guests, Antoine Dubois and Geneviève Laurent, were visibly reserved. They were from a different world, one where business was still, on some level, a human art form. Eve moved around the table like a shadow, refilling glasses, clearing plates, her presence so subtle she practically disappeared. It was this invisibility that allowed her to hear everything. "The beauty of the deal, Antoine," Damien was saying, swirling the $5,000 wine in his glass as if it were mouthwash, "is the labor flexibility. We move the primary workshops out of the Marais and into our new facility. Streamlined, efficient." Geneviève Laurent set her fork down. "Monsieur Thorne, the workshops you speak of are ateliers," she said, her voice cool. "They employ artisans who have trained for decades. Their families have worked that district for a century." "Artisans. Tradition," Damien laughed, a short, barking sound. "That's why you're making 2% margins and I'm making 40. You can't frame tradition and hang it in a bank vault. We'll retrain them. Put them in a call center. It's the modern world." Antoine Dubois looked pale. "This is not what we understood. It's progress, Antoine." "Now," Damien said, picking up the menu again, clearly wanting to change the subject back to something he could control. "Spending money. Let's order the main course. I'm thinking the lobster. Homard." He fumbled the word. "Eve," he barked, snapping his fingers. Eve, who was standing only 5 feet away, was at his side instantly. "Yes, sir?" "The menu," he said, tapping the script. "It's ridiculous. No one can read this. What's this? Riz de veau?" "That would be sweetbreads, sir," Eve replied softly. "Veal sweetbreads." Damien's face contorted in disgust. "Ugh, sounds provincial." "What is this?" He jabbed his finger at another item. "That is the pithivier de canard, sir. A duck pie with—" "I don't need a cooking lesson," Damien snapped. He was growing frustrated. He was trying to project an image of a global, sophisticated man, but the menu was exposing his limitations. And worse, it was happening in front of the people he was trying to dominate. He saw Mr. Henderson hovering anxiously by the bar, and a cruel idea seemed to form. He needed to reassert his dominance, and this waitress was the easiest target. He slammed the menu down on the table, making the silver jump. "This is absurd," he boomed. The nearby tables went silent. "I'm trying to host a multi-million-dollar dinner, and I'm at a French restaurant where the staff can't even explain the food." Eve's face remained impassive. "I was just explaining, sir." "You're not explaining," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. He leaned in, as if sharing a secret with his guests, but spoke loudly enough for the whole section to hear. "It's obvious. She can't even read the menu herself." The silence in the restaurant was now absolute. Eve felt a hot flush creep up her neck. This wasn't just rudeness, it was a public execution. "Sir, I assure you I am familiar with the menu," Eve said, her voice trembling slightly to her own fury. "Oh, really?" Damien sneered. He loved this. He was back in control. "Then what is this?" He pointed to the most complex item on the page, the lièvre à la royale. Eve began to answer. "That is a very traditional preparation of—" "Stop!" Damien laughed. "You're just sounding it out. It's pathetic." He turned to Antoine and Geneviève. "My apologies. I'm paying for 5-star service, and I get someone who's clearly, a high school dropout, working her way through, I don't know, community college." He looked directly at Eve, his eyes like chips of ice. "It's just sad. Honey, you're a waitress. You pour water. You're not paid to read. You're probably not even able to." And then, the final, devastating blow, delivered to his guests, but aimed right at her heart. "What's the point of a French restaurant," Damien Thorne announced to the room, "if she can't even read the menu?" The restaurant was a vacuum. Every eye was on Eve. Mr. Henderson looked like he was about to faint. Mark, the bartender, was watching with undisguised shock. Eve stood perfectly still. For one long, agonizing second, she was the girl in the apron, the failed academic, the daughter who had let her family down. Damien Thorne's words hung in the air, a cloud of toxic, expensive cologne and casual cruelty. He had broken the unspoken rule. He hadn't just insulted her. He had tried to annihilate her. He had tried to reduce her to a function, an object, a non-person. And in that second, something inside Eve Martin snapped. It was not the waitress who responded. It was the woman who had spent a year at the Sorbonne. The woman who had defended her thesis on Proust in Paris. The woman whose father, a former ambassador, had hosted dignitaries in French before she even knew English. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze locking with Damien's. And she spoke. Her first words were not in English. They were in French. Not the polite, halting French of a tourist, but the fluid, aristocratic, intimidatingly perfect French of the 16th arrondissement. "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur," she said. Her voice was cool and clear, slicing through the tension like a chilled knife. Damien Thorne froze, his sneer still on his face, but his eyes suddenly wide with confusion. Eve turned her body fully away from Damien and addressed Antoine Dubois and Geneviève Laurent directly. "Monsieur Dubois, Madame Laurent, je vous demande pardon pour cette malentendu. Mr. Dubois, Miss Laurent, I must ask your forgiveness for this misunderstanding." Antoine's eyebrows shot up. Geneviève leaned forward, a slow, fascinated smile spreading across her face. Eve continued, her French accelerating, becoming more complex. "Le lièvre à la royale," she said, gesturing to the item Damien had used as a weapon, "est, comme vous le savez, un plat d'une complexité historique. C'est la recette d'Antonin Carême, un lièvre farci de foie gras et de truffes, braisé des jours durant dans un sang de vin. The lièvre à la royale, as you know, is a dish of historical complexity. It is Antonin Carême's recipe, a hare stuffed with foie gras and truffles, braised for days in a wine-blood reduction." She didn't stop there. She didn't just define the dish. She gave its provenance. She discussed the nuance of the 1990 Margot he had so badly mispronounced, explaining how its notes of cassis and tobacco would struggle against the power of the lièvre, suggesting that a more robust Saint-Emilion, perhaps a 82 Cheval Blanc, if the cellar had one, would be a more harmonious pairing. She spoke for a full minute. It was not a defense. It was a dissertation. It was a flawless, brutal, and utterly elegant takedown. Damien Thorne's face had gone from red to a sickly, mottled white. He couldn't understand a single word, but he understood the tone. He understood the looks on his investors' faces. He was no longer the shark. He was the confused, flapping fish on the deck. Eve finished, then turned back to Damien. She switched to perfect, crisp English, her voice now devoid of any service industry deference. "The sweetbreads, sir, are a delicacy. The duck pie is classic, and the lièvre à la royale is one of the most complex dishes in the entire French haute cuisine canon. I am more than capable of reading the menu." She paused, holding his gaze. "The question," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than his shout, "is whether you are capable of ordering from it." Silence. Then, from across the table, Geneviève Laurent let out a single, sharp laugh. "Antoine," she said in French, her eyes sparkling with amusement, "I believe we have found our translator." Antoine Dubois nodded, his face a mask of respect. He looked at Eve, truly seeing her for the first time. "Mademoiselle," he said, in English, "please, sit." He gestured to the empty chair at their table. Mr. Thorne was just about to tell us about labor flexibility. The world had just tilted on its axis. A waitress does not sit with the guests. A waitress does not get offered a chair by a man in a $10,000 suit. Eve glanced at Mr. Henderson. He was clutching a service towel, his expression one of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked from Eve to Damien, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Damien Thorne finally found his voice. It was a strangled, furious rasp. "What the hell do you think you're doing? She's the help. Get her out of here." "She stays," Geneviève Laurent said. Her voice was no longer amused. It was steel. She didn't look at Damien. She looked at Eve. "Please, mademoiselle, we insist." Damien looked at his investors, at their set, determined faces, and realized he had lost control. He was trapped. If he made a scene, the deal was dead. If he let the waitress sit, he was humiliated. He chose the latter, sinking back into his chair, his face a thundercloud of fury. "Fine," he spat. "Fine, but add her tip to my bill." It was a pathetic attempt to regain the power dynamic. Eve didn't sit. Not fully. She took a half step back, a picture of professional grace. "Thank you, monsieur, madame, but I am here to serve. I am, however, happy to clarify any other items, on the menu or otherwise." The "or otherwise" hung in the air. Geneviève smiled. Very well. She picked up her fork and turned her attention back to Damien. But the dynamic of the entire table had shifted. The power was no longer with the billionaire. It was with the two French investors and their new, unexpected ally. The dinner resumed, but it was now a different meal. Antoine and Geneviève began speaking to Eve in French, asking her about the restaurant, the city, her background. Damien sat in simmering silence, unable to follow the rapid, nuanced conversation. "You studied at the Sorbonne?" Antoine asked, his eyes wide. "A master's program, yes, monsieur, in 18th century poetics. I was working on my doctorate at Columbia before circumstances changed." "Poetics," Geneviève mused. "And yet you understand wine pairings like a sommelier." "My father was in the diplomatic corps," Eve said, a simple statement that explained everything. "One learns to host." Damien couldn't stand it. "Enough with the pleasantries," he interrupted in English. "We're here to talk about the deal." He pulled a sheaf of papers from his briefcase. "The final draft, as we discussed." He slid the document across the table to Antoine. It was thick, printed in English, and dense with legalese. "As you can see," Damien said, Section 4B clearly outlines the protections for the artisan roles. Antoine and Geneviève put on their reading glasses. The mood at the table became serious. Eve, as was her job, moved silently to refill their water glasses, her eyes brushing over the page as she did. Damien was explaining the clause, but his words didn't seem to match the text. "So, as you see, protected status means they are guaranteed positions within the new corporate structure," Damien said smoothly. Eve's French was not her only skill. Her stalled doctorate had required her to parse dense, archaic texts. Modern legalese was, by comparison, simple. She saw the clause he was pointing to. For B, it didn't say guaranteed positions. It said eligible for consideration for positions, a completely different and utterly worthless promise. But it was the next clause, 4.c, that made her blood run cold. All existing workshop-level contracts and union agreements shall be rendered null and void upon transfer of assets, per the right-to-work provisions outlined in the non-EU subsidiary agreement. It wasn't just labor flexibility. It was a massacre. He was using a shell corporation in a non-EU country to strip mine the company, fire all the artisans, and destroy their union. He was using their own politeness and potential insecurity with complex English legal terms against them. Geneviève was still on 4B. Monsieur Thorne, this phrase, eligible for consideration. Standard language, Geneviève, Damien said, flashing a toothy, insincere smile. Just a formality. Now, if you'll turn to the signature page. Eve was holding the water pitcher. Her hand was shaking again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from rage. Eve stood frozen. This was the moment. This was the precipice. She could say nothing. She could walk away. It was not her deal. It was not her money. It was not her job. Or was it? She needed this job. She needed the paycheck that would barely cover her share of the rent. If she spoke, she would be fired. Instantly. Damien Thorne would see to it. He wouldn't just have her fired. He'd have her blacklisted from every restaurant in New York. She looked at Damien, at his smug, confident face. He was a predator, and he was about to consume a piece of history, a community of people, just to add another zero to his bank account. She looked at Antoine, who looked worried, but out of his depth with the legal jargon. She looked at Geneviève, who was sharp, but was missing the crucial link. It's not your business, Eve. Just pour the water. She saw the logo on the document's header. It was a small, family-owned French company, one she recognized from her time in Paris. They made exquisite, handcrafted silks. The artisans Damien was about to streamline were people. They were families. Eve made her choice. She didn't shout. She didn't point. She employed the single greatest tool in a waitress's arsenal, the artful accident. As she reached to fill Damien's water glass, she stumbled slightly. The pitcher tipped. A torrent of ice-cold water cascaded not onto the documents, that would be too obvious, but directly into Damien Thorne's lap. You! He leapt from his chair, a dark, spreading stain blooming across the front of his $1,000 trousers. The Patek Philippe was now dripping. Oh, mon Dieu! Eve cried, her hand flying to her mouth in a perfect picture of horror. Monsieur, I am so sorry. How clumsy! Damien was sputtering, trying to wipe at his suit with a napkin, his face a mask of apoplectic rage. You idiot! You did that on purpose. Sir, no, it was an accident, I swear. Eve was already dabbing at the table with her own cloth, her movements frantic. And in the chaos, as Damien was hopping and swearing, and Mr. Henderson was rushing over with a flurry of towels, Eve leaned in close to Geneviève Laurent. Under the cover of the commotion, she spoke one sentence in French, her voice a low, urgent whisper. Madame, lisez la clause 4C, la filiale. C'est le loup dans la bergerie. Madame, read clause 4C. The subsidiary. It is the wolf in the sheep's clothing. Eve then pulled back, her face a picture of tearful apology. Mr. Henderson, I am so sorry, I've ruined everything. Damien was still cursing. You're fired, you hear me? Fired! But Geneviève Laurent was no longer paying attention to the spectacle. Her sharp eyes, which missed nothing, had flicked from Eve's face back to the document. She had seen the sincerity, the urgency in Eve's expression. She picked up the papers. Her finger traced down the page, past 4B to 4C. She read it once. Then she read it again. The color drained from her face. She looked up, not at Damien, but at Antoine. She placed her finger on the text and pushed the document over to him. Antoine, she said in French, her voice suddenly like the Arctic. Lise. Read. Antoine read the clause. His face, which had been pale, turned a deep, dangerous red. Damien, finally sensing the change in the atmosphere, stopped dabbing at his crotch. What? What is it? It's just boilerplate. Antoine Dubois slowly, deliberately, folded the document in half. He stood up, his small, silver-haired frame suddenly radiating an authority that dwarfed Damien's. "Monsieur Thorn," he said, his French accent now thick with anger, "you are not a businessman. You are a vautour. A vulture. You came to us promising partnership. Instead, you offer us this poubelle. This garbage. Now wait a second," Damien stammered. "No, you wait," Geneviève said, standing as well. She pointed to Clause 40. "This non-EU subsidiary, this right-to-work provision, this is not labor flexibility. This is theft. This is a plan to destroy 100 years of history, to fire 1,000 people, our people." "It's just business," Damien shouted. "No," Antoine said softly. "It is not. And neither are we." He dropped the folded contract onto the table. "The deal is off, and I promise you, by the time our plane lands in Paris, everyone on the board of your company and everyone at the Financial Times will know exactly what kind of flexibility you practice." Damien Thorn's world collapsed in the space of 10 seconds. His face went through a rapid, grotesque series of emotions: confusion, denial, panic, and finally, pure, unadulterated rage. "You can't do that!" he yelled, the remnants of his dignity dripping onto the floor. "I'll sue you. I'll sue this whole restaurant." "Try," Geneviève said, pulling her wrap around her shoulders. "Our lawyers will be delighted." She turned and, to Eve's astonishment, gave a slight, formal bow. "Merci, mademoiselle." Then, she and Antoine turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Damien Thorn standing alone in a puddle of ice water and shattered ego. The restaurant was dead silent. Every diner was pretending not to look. Mr. Henderson approached, his face ashen. "Mr. Thorn," he began, I am. Damien, his face a purple mask, spun around. He couldn't attack the investors who had just walked out, so he turned his fury on the next available target. He pointed a shaking, wet finger at Eve. "You!" he seethed. "You! This is your fault. You worthless, conniving little—" "Sir, I must ask you to lower your voice," Henderson whispered, his career flashing before his eyes. "Fire her!" Damien screamed. "Fire her right now, or I will personally buy this entire building and turn it into a parking lot. Do you hear me, Henderson? I want her ruined." Mr. Henderson looked at Eve. His eyes, for the first time, held a flicker of something other than panic. It might have been admiration, but it was quickly replaced by pained, desperate pragmatism. He was a manager. He had a mortgage. "Eve," he said, his voice cracking, "go to my office. We need to talk." "Talk?" Damien scoffed. "No talk. Pack your things. Get out. You'll be lucky if you can get a job scrubbing toilets after I'm done with you." Eve looked at Damien Thorn. The fear was gone. The anxiety about her rent, her student loans, her aching feet. It had all burned away, replaced by a cold, quiet calm. She had done the right thing. She had spoken for people who couldn't speak for themselves. She untied the knot of her apron. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice clear and strong. She folded the apron and placed it neatly on the service stand. "I quit." "You can't quit. You're fired," Damien bellowed. Eve gave him a small, pitying smile. "It seems, Mr. Thorn, that for the first time in your life, you're not the one in charge." She turned to Mr. Henderson. "Thank you for the opportunity, sir." She walked away from the table, past the bar where Mark was staring, his mouth agape. She walked through the plush dining room, her head held high, her back straight. She was no longer Eve the waitress. She was Eve Martin, and she was done. She was halfway to the door when it opened. Antoine Dubois and Geneviève Laurent were standing there. They hadn't left. "We were waiting for you, mademoiselle," Geneviève said, a small, genuine smile on her face. You were, Eve stammered. Of course, Antoine said. We did not get to finish our dinner, and, he added, we did not get to offer you a job. Eve stopped. The lobby of L'Étoile d'Or, with its marble floors and fresh-cut lilies, suddenly felt like a movie set. A job? Damien Thorne, who had followed her into the lobby, let out a wet, incredulous laugh. A job? Doing what? Translating? You think you're going to hire her? Geneviève Laurent turned her sharp gaze on Damien. Monsieur Thorne, you should learn when to be silent. It is perhaps the one skill that might have saved you tonight. She turned back to Eve. Monsieur Dubois and I are not just investors. We are on the executive board of the Consortium Lux, she said, naming one of the largest luxury conglomerates in the world. We buy, restore, and protect historic brands. Brands like the one he, she gestured with contempt at Damien, was attempting to gut. Our business, Antoine continued, is not just about margins. It is about terroir, about authenticity. It is about understanding that a 1990 Margot and an 18th century poem come from the same place, a place of respect. We are opening a new North American acquisitions office, Geneviève said, her voice dropping into a business-like tone. We need someone to run our cultural vetting department, someone who understands both Wall Street and the Sorbonne, someone who can read a legal document as well as a wine list, someone who cannot be bullied. She stepped closer to Eve. We need someone like your father. Eve's heart stopped. My father? We did not recognize you at first without the name, Antoine said gently. But the fluency, the grace, the story of the diplomatic corps. You are Robert Martin's daughter, are you not? Eve could only nod, a lump forming in her throat. Her father, the disgraced ambassador, the man who had lost everything. We knew your father, Geneviève said. He was a good man, an honest man. We were saddened to hear of his misfortunes. It seems clear to us that his integrity was passed down. We cannot offer you a waitress's salary, Antoine said, a twinkle in his eye. The starting pay is 200,000 euros plus relocation. The office is in Paris. You would, of course, start as associate director. Eve felt dizzy. The floor seemed to tilt. 200,000 euros. Paris. A life. Her old life, but new. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Geneviève said. She pulled a card from a slim silver case. This is my personal number. Our flight is at 7 a.m. tomorrow from JFK. We will have a contract for you to review by then. Damien Thorne was vibrating with a rage so profound it rendered him speechless. He was watching his entire world, his entire system of belief, that money equals power, that the ruthless always win, crumble before his eyes. This nothing, this waitress, was being handed a life he could only dream of buying. You can't... This is... he stammered. Eve looked at him. She looked at the man who, an hour ago, had tried to break her, and she felt nothing but pity. She turned to Geneviève and Antoine. She took a deep breath, stood up straight, and offered her hand. Yes, Eve said, her voice ringing with a newfound clarity. Oui, j'accepte. I accept. The three words hung in the opulent, stunned lobby of L'Étoile d'Or. Oui, j'accepte. Damien Thorne looked as if Eve had physically struck him. His face, already blotchy with rage and damp from his accident, contorted into a mask of pure disbelief. You can't be serious. This is a joke. You're hiring a waitress? He spat, appealing to Antoine and Geneviève, his voice a desperate, wheezing sound. Geneviève Laurent didn't even spare him a glance. She kept her focus on Eve, her smile warm and genuine. "Excellent. We have much to discuss." "This is insane!" Damien shrieked, his voice cracking. He took a lurching step toward Eve, his wet trousers squeaking. You think you can just walk away? I'll... You will do nothing, Monsieur Thorne, Antoine said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a gavel. You are no longer a concern of ours. And, he added, with a frosty edge, you are no longer a concern of Mademoiselle Martin's. Mr. Henderson, who had been hovering near the coat check like a terrified ghost, finally scuttled forward. "Mr. Thorne, sir, perhaps we can get you a towel, a new pair of trousers? Our tailor." Damien spun on him. "You!" he bellowed. "You let this happen. You let your staff assault me and sabotage my business." "Sir, Henderson flinched, but Eve saw something new in his eyes. The terror was still there, but it was mixed with a profound, bone-deep weariness. He was a man at the end of his rope. Eve looked at her former manager, a man who had only ever shown her stressed-out indifference. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of pity. She turned to Antoine. "Monsieur," she said softly in French. "Mr. Henderson, he is a good man. He was not at fault." Antoine's gaze softened. He looked at Henderson, who was trembling, clearly expecting his own life to be over. Antoine gave a curt, aristocratic nod. "Madame Laurent and I are frequent diners. We will remember his discretion." It was a simple statement, but it was a shield. Damien Thorne's power had evaporated. He could no longer ruin anyone. "A car is waiting, Eve," Geneviève said, gently touching her arm, guiding her toward the heavy glass doors. Eve took a step, then paused. She turned back. The entire restaurant was watching. The diners, the busboys, the other wait staff. And standing behind the polished mahogany bar, Mark was holding a polishing cloth. He met her eyes. He didn't cheer. He didn't smirk. He just raised his glass, a silent, stunned cheers that said everything. Eve nodded, once. As she and her new employers stepped out onto the sidewalk, the cold November air felt like a baptism. A gleaming black Mercedes S-Class was idling at the curb. A chauffeur in a black suit opened the rear door. "This is all happening very fast," Eve murmured, the adrenaline beginning to wear off, leaving her hands shaking. "The best things in life often do," Antoine said, gesturing for her to get in. "We've taken the liberty of booking you a room at the Carlyle. It's just a few blocks from here." Eve's head swam. The Carlyle, a place she'd only ever walked past. "But my apartment, my things, my roommates. I have nothing." "You have everything that matters," Geneviève said, sliding in beside her. "You have your mind, your integrity, and now you have us." "Your old life ended 10 minutes ago," Antoine said from the opposite seat as the car pulled silently into traffic. "Your new one begins now. We fly at 7 a.m. from JFK. "Tomorrow?" Eve gasped. "But I can't." "You can," Geneviève said. "Here is what you will do. The car will take you to your apartment in Queens. You will pack one suitcase, only what is essential, your passport, your laptop, the things that are irreplaceable, the rest, the clothes, the furniture. They are just things. We will handle the termination of your lease. We will have the rest of your belongings professionally packed and shipped or disposed of as you wish." Eve looked at these two people who operated at a speed and a level of efficiency she could barely comprehend. They hadn't just offered her a job, they had staged an extraction. "Go," Antoine said. "Make your peace with that life. Your car to the airport will be at your apartment at 4 a.m. sharp." The ride from the Upper East Side to her walk-up in Astoria was a journey between two universes. The Mercedes, smelling of new leather and quiet power, glided over the Queensboro Bridge, leaving the glittering spires of Manhattan behind. When it pulled up outside her building, with its graffiti-laced entryway and flickering fluorescent light, the chauffeur didn't bat an eye. "I will wait here, mademoiselle." Eve walked up the 3 flights of stairs, the smell of her neighbor's cooking, garlic and old grease, clinging to the air. She fumbled with her key, her hand still trembling. She opened the door. Her roommate, Sarah, was asleep on the lumpy sofa, the TV blaring a reality show. The small apartment was a mess of takeout containers and textbooks. This had been her reality, her prison. For a moment, she was paralyzed. How could she bridge the gap between this room and the Carlisle? Between a shared, crumbling bathroom and a 7 a.m. flight to Paris in first class? 1 suitcase. She moved quietly, automatically. She pulled her only piece of luggage, a battered carry-on, from the back of her closet. What was essential? Not the 2 black and white uniforms, which she folded and left on her unmade bed. A final, symbolic shedding of her skin. Not the worn-out non-slip shoes. Not the cheap sweaters or the jeans with the frayed hems. In went her laptop, containing her half-finished, long-abandoned thesis on Proust. A small framed photograph of her father, standing on the steps of the embassy, looking proud. Her mother's simple gold locket, her dog-eared, heavily annotated copy of Swan's Way, her passport. And that was it. There was room to spare. She realized with a hollow shock that almost everything she owned was replaceable. She sat on the edge of her bed. She had 2 calls to make. First, her landlord. It went to voicemail. "Mr. Petrov, this is Eve Martin from 3B. I know this is sudden, but I have to break my lease. I'm moving out, effective immediately. I'll be forfeiting my security deposit, of course. Someone will be in touch about my things." She hung up, feeling a wild, irresponsible thrill. Second, her father. She dialed the number for his small condo in Florida. He picked up on the 3rd ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Dad, it's me." "Eve?" he said, suddenly wide awake, his voice laced with the old familiar panic. He always expected bad news. "It's past 1 in the morning. Is everything... Are you okay? Are you hurt?" I'm okay, Dad." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "I'm more than okay." "What is it? You sound... different." "Dad, do you remember Antoine Dubois from the Paris embassy? And Geneviève Laurent?" There was a long pause. "Dubois? Of course I remember Antoine. A brilliant man. Sharp. Honest as the day is long. Geneviève, yes, she was with the luxury consortium. A powerhouse. Why? What about them?" I met them tonight, Dad. At the restaurant." At your job?" He sounded confused. "It's a long story, but they were there, and there was a situation." "Eve, what did you do?" he asked, his voice strained. "I spoke French," she said simply, "and I read a contract." She explained in a rush what had happened. Damien Thorne's sneer, the menu, the humiliation, her response, the contract, the spilled water, the clause, the deal collapsing. Her father was silent, just breathing into the phone. "Dad?" "My God, Eve," he whispered. That's my girl. That's my daughter. That's not all, Dad." Her voice cracked. They knew who I was. They remembered you. And they offered me a job." "A job? What, as a translator? A consultant?" "Associate Director, North American Acquisitions, Cultural Vetting." "Dad," she said the number, 200,000 euros. Starting." A choked sound came from the other end of the phone. "Eve, I'm in Paris, Dad. I'm going. The flight is at 7 a.m. He was crying. She hadn't heard her father cry, since the day they'd lost the house. I knew it, he wept. I knew your talent, your mind. I thought my failures had ruined you. I thought I dragged you down with me. You never ruined me, Dad, she said, tears now streaming down her own face, dripping onto her old comforter. You trained me. Everything I did tonight, I learned it from you. How to be strong, how to be honest, how to read the room, how to host. Oh, ma chérie, he said, switching to their private language. Je suis si fier, si incroyablement fier. I am so proud, so incredibly proud. Fonce, Yves, fonce, ne regarde pas en arrière. Go for it, Yves, go, don't look back. I love you, Dad. I'll call you from Paris. I love you. Fly safe. She hung up and sat in the silence of her tiny, cluttered room. She zipped her single, half-empty suitcase. She didn't belong here anymore. She walked out, not even bothering to turn off the light. The chauffeur was standing by the open door of the Mercedes, as if she'd only been gone for a minute. JFK, mademoiselle. JFK, she confirmed. At 4:30 a.m., the airport's private aviation terminal was a world away from the chaos of the main terminals. It was a quiet, hushed lounge with leather armchairs and soft lighting. Antoine and Geneviève were already there, sipping espresso and reading the morning's financial papers. Yves, Geneviève said, standing to greet her, you look lighter. I feel it, Yves said. Good. We have some things for you. Antoine slid a thick manila folder across the table. Your contract. Read it, of course. But our legal team has drawn it up as we discussed. And your ticket. You are in 1A. Geneviève slid a second, slimmer folder over. This is a small advance. For incidentals when you land. A corporate card. And, she paused, we took the liberty of making 2 calls. One to the holding company for your student loans. They have been consolidated and paid. Consider it a signing bonus. Eve's knees buckled. She had to sit down. The student loans. The number that haunted her sleep. The number that had chained her to that restaurant. It was gone. I don't know what to say. How did you... Eve, Antoine said, looking at her over his glasses. When we find talent, we are thorough. We made 1 call to an old friend, a provost at Columbia. We know you were their star. We know what happened to your father's finances. This is not charity. It is a strategic investment in a valuable asset. You are that asset. Now, drink your coffee. We board in 20 minutes. On the plane, the world transformed. She turned left. The suite in 1A was larger than her bedroom in Queens. A flight attendant, seeing her, smiled. Bonjour, Mademoiselle Martin. Puis-je vous offrir un verre de champagne? Avec plaisir, Eve replied, her voice steady. She held the cold, sparkling glass. She had the contract open on the tray table. It was all there. The salary, the housing allowance in the Marais, the relocation bonus. As the plane climbed over the Atlantic, the sun rising and painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold, Eve connected to the Wi-Fi. She had to know. She typed Damien Thorne into the search bar. The results were not just bad, they were catastrophic. Thorne acquisition of Soyeries Dubois collapses amid bad faith allegations. Wall Street Journal, Consortium Lux board members, allege systemic ethical breaches in Thorne deal, stock tumbles 22%. Financial Times, Damien Thorne's shark reputation, in tatters after botched Paris deal, board calls emergency meeting. Bloomberg. She scrolled, and there it was, a grainy, vicious paparazzi photo, clearly taken from across the street as he'd stormed out of L'Étoile d'Or. It was unmistakable. His $1,000 suit was soaked. His face was a mask of apoplectic fury. The caption read, "A damp defeat. Damien Thorne seen leaving L'Etoile d'Or after the $50 million deal collapsed. This was the karma. It wasn't just that he'd lost the deal. He was a laughing stock. His entire reputation was built on being an untouchable, immaculate predator. And he had been undone and publicly humiliated by a waitress and a pitcher of water. The shark was bleeding, and every other shark in the water was circling. Yves closed the laptop. His story was over. Geneviève, sitting in the suite across the aisle, had been watching her. She raised her own glass. "He built his house on sand, Yves," she called over, her voice clear in the quiet cabin. "The tide always comes in. It is a lesson he was long overdue to learn." The flight attendant returned, smiling warmly. "Mademoiselle, would you care to see the menu for our dinner service?" Yves looked at the leather-bound card. Filet de bœuf, homard thermidor, potage parmentier. She thought of the menu that had been her weapon, her test, her key. This one was different. This was a menu of choices. She smiled. "The lobster sounds wonderful." And, she added, her mind flashing back to her own recommendation, a glass of the Saint-Emilion, the 82 if you have it. Landing at Charles de Gaulle was not like arriving. It was like returning. A private car, not a Mercedes this time, but a stately, elegant black Citroën, was waiting for them on the tarmac. As they bypassed customs, an attaché handling their passports, Yves felt the familiar, damp chill of a Parisian morning. It was a smell of diesel, wet cobblestones and baking bread. It was the smell of home. They drove through the awakening city, the grey light soft on the Haussmann buildings. This was not a tourist's Paris. This was the city she knew by heart. The car didn't take her to a hotel. It wound through the narrow, ancient streets of the Marais and pulled to a stop on the Place des Vosges. "Your new apartment, Yves," Geneviève said. "The company keeps it for visiting executives. For now it is yours." It was a stunning, light-filled apartment on the 3rd floor, its tall windows overlooking the beautiful, formal park. It was furnished with an elegant, minimalist mix of modern and antique. "Rest," Antoine said from the doorway. "Sleep. Reacclimate. A car will pick you up at 9 a.m. on Monday. Your new life awaits." They left her. She was alone. Yves walked through the silent, beautiful space. On the mantelpiece, a small silver frame had been placed. It wasn't her photo of her father. It was a different one. In it, a younger Antoine Dubois and a younger Robert Martin were laughing, glasses of wine in their hands, at an embassy function. On the back, in Geneviève's sharp handwriting, it said, "To new beginnings and old friendships." She finally let go, sinking onto the velvet sofa, and slept. It was Monday morning. Yves awoke not to a blaring alarm, but to the soft light of the Paris morning and the distant sound of a church bell. She was no longer the girl in the apron. The company's advance had been put to good use. She was dressed in a simple, perfectly tailored, navy blue suit, her hair pulled back in a professional chignon. She left the apartment at 8 a.m. Her car wasn't due for an hour. She needed to walk. She walked out into the Place des Vosges, the gravel crunching under her new, sensible, leather-soled heels. She turned onto Rue Saint-Antoine and walked into a small boulangerie that smelled of heaven. "Bonjour, madame." The baker, a flour-dusted woman with kind eyes, greeted her. "Bonjour. Un café crème et un croissant aux amandes, s'il vous plaît." "Voilà, madame." She sat at a tiny, round marble table by the window, watching the city come to life. The simple act of ordering, of being called Madame, of sitting and enjoying a coffee without needing to rush, felt like the ultimate luxury. She unfolded the newspaper. The final update on Damien Thorne was buried on page 6 of the financial section. He had been officially ousted by his board and was now facing multiple shareholder lawsuits for gross negligence and reputational damage. A total, complete, and quiet fall. She felt nothing. No pity, no triumph, just closure. Her phone buzzed. A text from her father. "First day. I'm so proud of you. Give 'em hell, ma chérie." Eve smiled, taking a sip of her coffee. It was hot, strong, and perfect. She thought about the menu at L'Étoile d'Or. That laminated piece of paper, designed to intimidate, had been her humiliation, her weapon, and her liberation. But this, she thought, looking at the small blackboard behind the baker listing pastries, this was a new menu. A menu of her own life. She was no longer serving. She was no longer invisible. She could read every item, and this time she was finally ordering for herself. And just like that, a single sentence in the right language changed everything. Eve didn't just get a new job, she reclaimed her life. She proved that worth isn't determined by the apron you wear or the money in your bank account, but by the integrity you hold and the courage you have to speak up. Damien Thorne learned the hard way that when you underestimate people, you are the one who ends up looking small. This story is a powerful reminder that you never know the true story of the person standing right in front of you. The person you ignore just might be the one who holds all the cards. What did you think of Eve's incredible comeback? Have you ever seen someone get so spectacularly put in their place? Let me know your favorite part of the story in the comments below. Thank you for listening. If you loved this story, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this video with a friend who needs to see it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of drama, karma, and justice. We have new stories coming every week, and you won't want to miss what happens next.